Why does almost the entire population of Canada live within just a few hours of the United States? This is the second largest country on Earth. It stretches across 6 time zones. It has endless forests, countless lakes, and enough land to fit dozens of European countries. So why do nearly 90% of Canadians choose to live in a tiny strip of land right next to America? At first, it looks like a coincidence. It isn't. It's one of geography's greatest stories. Imagine a country so enormous that from space it seems almost limitless. Now imagine that almost nobody lives in most of it. Fly across northern Canada, and for hours, you'll see nothing. No highways, no farms, just forests, mountains, ice, and silence. Head south, and suddenly the emptiness disappears. Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Ottawa, Calgary. Almost every major Canadian city hugs one invisible line, the border with the United States. It's almost as if someone drew a line across the continent and told an entire nation, don't go any farther. But why? Was Canada always like this? Or did history, nature, and economics slowly push an entire country south? Because once you see the answer, you'll never look at a map of North America the same way again. Take a look at a map. Canada looks gigantic. Actually, it is gigantic. It's the second largest country in the world, nearly 10 million square kilometers, larger than the United States, larger than Europe if measured country by country. Looking at the map, you might expect Canada's cities to be spread everywhere. But zoom in. Almost every major city sits incredibly close to the US. Toronto, about 2 hours from the border. Montreal, less than an hour. Vancouver, roughly 45 minutes. Most of Canada's population forms a narrow ribbon stretching from east to west. In some places, that ribbon is only about 100 miles from the border. So, what makes the rest of the country so empty? The answer begins with something Canadians can't control: their climate. Most people know Canada is cold. Few realize just how cold. Winter isn't simply a season here. In much of Canada, it's the environment that decides whether civilization can even exist. Large parts of northern Canada spend months below freezing. Some communities experience temperatures below -40 degrees. At that point, Celsius and Fahrenheit become the same number. Cars refuse to start. Metal becomes brittle. Skin can freeze in minutes. Agriculture becomes nearly impossible. And without farming, large permanent populations become incredibly difficult. People often imagine Canada as endless forests, but much of the far north lies beyond the tree line. Instead of forests, there's tundra, a landscape where the ground stays frozen beneath the surface, sometimes for thousands of years. This is called permafrost. Building roads there isn't easy. Building cities is even harder. Every house, every pipeline, every airport must fight against frozen ground that shifts with the seasons. Nature constantly pushes back. So while Canada has enormous land, much of it has never been friendly to large human settlement. But climate alone doesn't explain everything. Because there are cold countries that still have people living much farther north. So what makes Canada's case different? History. Country grew from the south. Long before Canada became a country, people already knew where life was easiest. Indigenous nations had lived across Canada for thousands of years. But when European settlers arrived, they naturally established colonies where survival was simplest. That meant rivers, fertile land, trade routes, and milder weather. Almost all of those existed near today's US border. The St. Lawrence River became one of North America's greatest highways. It connected the Atlantic Ocean deep into the continent. Cities like Quebec and Montreal flourished because ships could actually reach them. Further west, the Great Lakes became another economic engine. Then came railroads. Instead of expanding north, Canada expanded sideways, east to west. Always following the southern corridor where conditions made sense. Every new town encouraged another. Every railway attracted more settlers. Every farm supported another generation. Cities grow where other cities already exist. Economists call this agglomeration. People simply call it opportunity. And once millions of people had settled there was very little reason to leave. But another force would make this southern belt even more attractive. A neighbor. One that would eventually become the world's largest economy. Geography gave Canada something incredibly valuable. Not warmer weather, not richer soil, a customer. Today, Canada shares the world's longest international border with the United States, more than 5,500 miles. And on the other side, live over 300 million people. Factories naturally appeared close to that market. Cars built in Ontario could quickly reach Detroit. Goods from Vancouver could move into Seattle. Energy from Alberta could flow south. Trade became faster, cheaper, more profitable. Instead of building expensive infrastructure deep into the Arctic, businesses invested where customers already existed. Cities followed jobs. Jobs followed trade. Trade followed geography. Over time, the border became less of a barrier and more of an economic magnet. It's one of the busiest trading relationships on Earth. In many ways, Canada's southern cities aren't isolated from America. They're connected to one enormous North American economy. But here's something fascinating. If the border disappeared tomorrow, Canada still probably wouldn't move north, because another invisible force is keeping people exactly where they are. Infrastructure. Think about your own city. Why does it keep growing? Because it already has everything. Schools, hospitals, universities, airports, roads, businesses, family. Moving somewhere else means rebuilding all of that. That's incredibly expensive. Canada faces the same challenge. Building one road into the far north can cost billions, maintaining it even more. Supplying remote towns often requires airplanes, ice roads, or seasonal shipping. Simple groceries can cost 2, 3, sometimes 4 times more than they do in southern cities. Daily life becomes dramatically more expensive. Meanwhile, the southern corridor already has everything people need. Once cities become large enough, they create momentum. That momentum keeps attracting more people, which creates even larger cities. It's a cycle that's surprisingly difficult to break. But then another question appears. If the North is so empty, why does Canada still keep it? The empty North isn't really empty. Look at Canada's northern territories. They appear almost blank. But blank doesn't mean worthless. Beneath those forests, mountains, and frozen landscapes lie enormous natural resources. Gold, nickel, diamonds, rare earth minerals, oil, natural gas, fresh water, some of the world's largest untapped reserves. As climate change slowly alters the Arctic, new shipping routes are beginning to emerge. The Northwest Passage, once nearly impossible to navigate, is becoming accessible for longer periods each year. Suddenly, land that once seemed isolated may become strategically important. Countries around the Arctic are watching closely, because the future value of Canada's north may look very different from its past. So while relatively few people live there today, its importance could grow dramatically in the decades ahead. Which brings us back to the original question. Did Canadians choose to live near America, or did geography quietly make that decision for them? When people look at a map, they usually notice borders. But borders rarely explain where people live. Climate does, history does, trade does, infrastructure does. Canada isn't crowded near the United States because Canadians simply prefer America. They're there because thousands of years of geography, followed by centuries of history, created the perfect place for cities to grow. The farther north you travel, the more nature asks a difficult question. How badly do you want to live here? For most people, the answer has always been the same. Stay south. Yet the story isn't over. As technology improves, as resources become more valuable, and as the Arctic transforms, Canada's empty north may not stay empty forever. The map we've known for centuries could slowly begin to change. And maybe that's the biggest lesson of all. Countries don't decide where civilizations appear. Geography does. At least, until humans find a way to rewrite it.